G'day everyone, E53 here, and if you've seen the title of the video, you know what it's going to be about. Wow, here's all I've got to say, just wow. The car with the most money behind it of any car, probably at Indianapolis, the McLaren, has not made the field with Fernando Alonso driving. And I waited a day to make this video, and I'm glad I did, because it's allowed the chance for a lot more information to come out. And the thing that really that really got to me yesterday, I mean, I was like a lot of McLaren fans or Alonso fans, of which I'm both, were probably pretty mad. And I was on the train on my way to work, and I just had this absolute complete rant in my head that I was going to go on with, but I'm glad I wasn't able to actually make the video yesterday, and today calmed down a little bit. A whole bunch of additional info's come out and so on, so I wanted to run through a little bit about, for those who maybe haven't been keeping in touch, I've read just about everything that's come out about it, watched everything that's come out about it, interviews, press conferences, releases, those sorts of things. And just want to maybe give everyone a little bit of an insight into where it all went so horribly wrong, because from the outside looking in, it's sort of almost hard to believe. And I guess what it came down to was the fact that McLaren were completely unprepared for the race, which sounds bizarre for a team with their experience, but they just were not prepared. They didn't have the right people in the right places. Bob Fernley's since been let go. He was the one actually put in charge of that team, and it's hard to tell what the actual story was there with Fernley, because his contract only went up to the day of the Indy 500 anyway, and of course they're not going to be there, so I'm guessing in a way it's just the fact that his contract wasn't extended or anything like that. But they seem to, just the fact that they felt the need to take Gilles de Ferran away from the F1 project and send him over to Indy to find out what the hell was going on, probably said that from the beginning that Fernley wasn't really getting the job done, certainly not to the satisfaction of McLaren. So how did it come to this? And I think that's a question that a lot of people are asking. I've seen some people with the genius internet comments that we tend to get around motorsport saying that it was all Fernando's fault. Oh, he destroys a team and he's this, that and the other and so on, which is complete garbage, of course. Everybody knows that. But I've found a couple of articles online that seem to sort of chronicle a little bit about the trouble that they had. So, of course, their first test, they scheduled one test prior to Indy, which probably wasn't enough, at Texas Motor Speedway, and by the time they got there, the car wasn't actually ready to go because it didn't have a steering wheel. For some reason, McLaren had decided that they wanted to make their own steering wheel, because apparently the steering wheel that Penske and Andretti and all of them use is not up to the job, I'm not sure. But anyway, so they were looking at getting their own steering wheel done. They couldn't get it done on time, and they ended up having to go and get one from Cosworth, which is the one that everyone else uses. And when they got it, it didn't have any gear shift paddles on it. And when they rang up Cosworth to ask why, Cosworth said, well, you didn't order any gear shift paddles. So it started out brilliantly. So they didn't get out onto track at Texas. They booked the track for the day. They didn't get out until midday. And then they found that they had other little issues. There was a issue with the car itself, the chassis that they were running at the test. It was the wrong colour. They went and got it from Carlin and it was the wrong colour. And of course you had media there and everything, so it had to be correct. So they sent that back, and that Carlin was supposed to be repainting that. So that became their spare chassis, and they started working with the chassis that they built themselves in-house. And from there, they had little electrical issues that cut their run time down at that test as well. But the old saying, better get this out the way in testing and so on. And so they arrived at Indy for, I guess, the pre-Indy test, and they had more mechanical issues there. They had another electronics problem and everything else. And then, of course, we got into practice proper, and they were missing track time left, right and centre with all manner of mechanical issues and operational issues and so on. And that's when, unfortunately, the crash happened on the Wednesday, where Alonso's gone up into the wall. He's not the first to do it. He won't be the last to do it. He just put his hand up and said, look, that was me. I underestimated the amount of push that the car was going to have when I was following another car, and went straight up into the fence, and pretty big impact. So of course, then the cars come back on the truck, and the truck has hit the bridge that it was going under, and just a comedy of errors from there. It just seemed that nothing was going right for them. And then of course they needed their spare chassis back from Carlin. So they've said, Carlin, where's that chassis we gave you a couple of weeks ago? Still in the paint shop, hasn't been painted yet. It's 30 minutes away from Indy, hasn't been painted, hasn't been touched. So Carlin were obviously busy preparing their own disasters to take to the track, because 2 out of the 3 Carlin entered cars did not qualify either. In fact, the only cars which failed to qualify for the Indy 500 were connected to Carlin in some way, being the 2 Carlin cars and the McLaren. And even in his press conference, Fernando sort of said, because somebody actually asked him, what was the reason behind it, what specifically went wrong. And he said he didn't want to go too far into it, but maybe look at the other cars around them that didn't qualify either. Now, F1 journalists, knowing the kind of guarded way in which F1 drivers speak, would have latched onto that comment like terriers and run with it. But the Indy guys, I suppose, are a little bit less used to that kind of subtlety, and nobody really kind of picked up or asked him to go into that any further. So anyway, they finally got this car painted, and by the time they finally got the spare assembled, they'd lost Thursday as well. They didn't get out at all on Thursday. And then, of course, we had Friday, Fast Friday, where all the teams are allowed to run qualifying boosts to get their qualifying setups dialed in. Meanwhile, realistically, they were still doing the shakedown on the McLaren car at that point. They weren't even anywhere near close to being able to work on a qualifying setup, trimming downforce away. They just hadn't got the laps under their belt to even get the suspension tuned properly or anything like that. They'd lost so much track time, hours and hours of track time that they'd lost, and they were just not even slightly prepared. And then sort of it came around to qualifying day, and they were struggling, and they were sort of throwing everything at it, sort of just randomly in terms of last minute sort of preparations and so on. And eventually, when it got to the stage that they actually hadn't made that top 30 and had to run in the last row shootout, that they finally admitted, they're like, look, we really need help here. So they've gone back to Andretti, who of course they partnered with so successfully in 2017, which still remains for me one of the motorsport highlights of the decade. That particular race, seeing Alonso and McLaren go over there, with Alonso as an active Formula 1 driver at the time, missing Monaco to go there was absolutely just crazy, and really, really enjoyable. And unfortunately, they weren't able to partner with Andretti again this time, because Honda have got their panties in a bunch about some of the things that McLaren and Alonso said back when Honda used to supply engines to the F1 team, to the McLaren F1 team. And that irks me a little bit, because, yeah, sure, McLaren were always saying it's all the Honda engine, our chassis is perfect and everything, and that proved out not to be the case. McLaren's chassis was clearly not the best in the field. They overstated how good it actually was. But when you're consistently running out, and everyone can actually hear you running out of KERS deployment halfway down the straight for 3 years, don't get all high and mighty when somebody criticises you. There's 2 world champion drivers in the cars. They ruined the last few years of Fernando's F1 career. They ruined pretty much the entirety of Jenson Button's F1 career, apart from the time that he spent with McLaren and Brawn. The only favour they ever did to Jenson Button was actually leaving the sport to allow Brawn to take over and allow him to go in there and win a championship. They have absolutely no justification at all for acting all high and mighty. Oh, they criticised us, rah, rah, rah. They criticised you because your engines were crap. That's why they criticised you. That's why you looked bad in public. That's why you lost face, because your engines were crap. And then you came to the Indy 500 with Fernando the first time, and your engine was crap again, because it blew up 20 laps from home when he was in with a shot of the victory. So don't act all high and mighty now and stop Andretti from partnering with McLaren. That's ridiculous. But anyway, that's what they did. So Andretti just kind of quietly sold them a set of dampers, which is one of the only areas allowed to be developed in IndyCar. So it's quite a big thing. So to get Andretti dampers on the car, but then of course it was never going to be that simple. McLaren have thrown the Andretti dampers at the car. They've gone out for their practice in the morning, and it turns out McLaren had actually made a mistake converting the metric system excuse me, the metric system into the imperial system, which were when they were changing the shockers over, and as a result the car went out on track dragging its ass around like a dog that had worms, blowing sparks everywhere, completely ridiculous. And when it came back in, you know, they tried to fix it, couldn't fix it, and so on. They were able to fix it a bit, but not really. And then, of course, when they finally got out to have their final run, they say that they had a car that was actually capable of 229 miles an hour, which would easily have got them in the field. But it wasn't that easy. Of course it wasn't. They'd left the wrong gearing in it, and it was only geared to run 227.5 miles an hour. Which, of course, means that they were never going to make the race. It was an absolute comedy of errors. It reminds me of the air crash investigators. They always say that for an air crash to actually happen, it's like layers of Swiss cheese, and you really need all the holes to line up in order for an accident to actually happen. What they're actually saying is they need a number of things to go wrong. And wow, did they go wrong here. So, you know, Zach Brown is furious, obviously. He's fired Fernley already, or not renewed his contract, depending on how you want to look at it. He's fired a couple of other guys. He says that, you know, there's quite a few people there that will be dealt with because they honestly don't deserve to work for McLaren, and that's about as clear as you can get. So there we go. All of that together means that they didn't make it. You think without any one of those problems, they would have been able to achieve another 0.19 miles an hour, or whatever it was, 0.019 miles an hour, by which they missed out. But of course, them missing out, good news for Juncos Racing, that have had to overcome such a huge amount themselves to get into the race. So I'm going to be following them. I've been following them closely ever since they announced the problems that they were having. They managed to get into the race, which was fantastic. And for anyone who doesn't know, this team, they arrived, they're only a small team anyway, they arrived in Indianapolis, got off the plane, only to find out that both the sponsors had pulled out. Like, both of their sponsors, they only had two, and they both pulled out, and they found out about this once they landed in Indy. Now they've made the race. I hope those two sponsors absolutely choke on it and go out of business. You don't do that to a small team like that on the eve of them arriving at the Indy Speedway for that. Absolutely disgusting. So I hope they both go out of business. But anyway, they made it into the race. Dragon Speed is a story which has kind of been a little bit swept under the rug as well. You can Google them to find out all the tribulations that they've been through going into this race as well, and they qualified easily without drama. So it's not made too much of headlines, but it's a great story nonetheless. And I guess that brings us on now to what is going to happen from here as far as McLaren and their Indy program. Yeah, they've been making noises about coming into Indy full time for a long time, and everyone sort of assumes that that's probably going to be with Alonso. I'm not so sure. I think that just judging by the way Alonso is sort of talking and taking, you can always take a lot more from listening to them actually say the words rather than sort of reading what's been written. And the impression that I get from listening to Fernando is he's not really that interested in doing anything full time. He wants to get this WSE season out the way, win that, and I think he's going to be perfectly happy from that point onwards, just going around sampling different machinery, mastering all these different skills, and trying to win big events. Dakar Rally, Bathurst 1000, Indy 500's obviously still on that list, and so on. So if McLaren come into IndyCar full-time, I don't see Fernando actually being one of those drivers, because I don't think he's going to be interested in it. I think he might join them once a year for the 500, at least until he wins it. But I don't think that that's going to be an avenue that he's going to want to pursue. So where does that leave us then? McLaren have gone to a lot of time and expense to set all this up. I think they still are going to come in full-time, although it may take a little bit more convincing of the shareholders who actually are going to give final sign-off to it. But I think they will. And if I had to take a guess on who the drivers would be, I think, yeah, and this is not a new opinion, because a lot of people have been sort of talking about this already when it looked like they might do it at the start of 2019. First of all, Stoffel van Dorn. He's the logical choice. I think he's been kind of hovering around. He's still connected to McLaren, even though he's not driving in their F1 team anymore. And I think he'd be a really good choice to get in there. He's a very capable guy, even if he wasn't able to show that in Formula One. And the other one that I think will probably come along at some stage, if not in their first season, is Scott Dixon. They were sort of definitely talking to him in the later parts of 2018. He's really achieved everything in IndyCar. He's got 5 titles. He's got nothing left to prove. He's the best driver, top driver in the sport. But I think the carrot of, he's a New Zealander, of course, and to be building up a team linked with, started by Bruce McLaren, the all-time New Zealand motorsport hero, would be too much for him to refuse. And I think that, if you're going to start a new project, do it after you've won everything like he has, and then come back and look to build something there. So I think that that'll be very, very enticing, especially with what McLaren can afford to pay him. It won't be a small amount of money either. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Scott Dixon actually make his way over there should they come in next year. But in the meantime, they've got a lot of rebuilding to do. Huge amount of debriefing, soul searching, everything else, and I'm fairly sure they'll be able to put everything right. They just weren't ready, and that's all it comes down to. They were partnered with Carlin, which was the wrong partner, quite clearly, because they don't have their act together either. And all things together, it's led to one of the biggest motorsport stories of the whole year, which is them missing out on the Indy 500, which is a huge shame for everyone. That's, I'm sure there's more than a few people who've bought tickets to that race specifically to see that driver and team, and now they're not going to be there. So very disappointing all round. It's disappointing for all of us who were looking forward to watching that as well. So anyway, watch this space. I think that it's going to be interesting to see what announcements come out of McLaren in the next few months, because they're going to need to start getting their house in order fairly well soon if they are intending to do anything full-time in IndyCar in the next in 2020. So watch this space and keep your eyes open, and well, I guess we'll just see what happens. But interested in hearing your thoughts anyway, so please leave a comment down below, especially if you've managed to dig up any further information coming out of anywhere that might help to shed a little bit of extra light on what's actually gone on here, because as I say, I'm only piecing it together from the bits and pieces that I've managed to find coming out of McLaren. So until next time, thanks very much.
Well, that was fucking dreadful.